Everyone thinks they know pirates. Eye patches, parrots, buried treasure maps marked with a big red X, and a one-legged captain shouting orders over a stormy deck. It's a thrilling image, and we owe it to books, theater, and Hollywood. But the real world of piracy was far more complex and often more fascinating. When you look past the myths, you find a story of desperate sailors, bold opportunists, and floating communities that mix danger, democracy, and survival in ways that still surprise historians today. Let's break down some of the biggest myths about pirates and uncover what was really going on beyond the legend. The first myth: pirates were simply ruthless killers. In truth, most of them were practical men chasing profit, not chaos. Their goal wasn't destruction, it was capture. A merchant ship loaded with sugar, gold, or spices meant wealth for everyone on board, so violence was used, but carefully. Many crews preferred intimidation to open combat because a surrendered ship was more valuable than a sunken one. Pirates were often more like rough businessmen than maniacs. They planned raids, voted on targets, divided the spoils fairly, and cared for injured crewmates, not out of kindness, but because every able sailor was vital for survival. The second myth: buried treasure and maps with a perfect X. It's a wonderful story, but it's almost entirely fictional. Real pirates didn't hide gold, they spent it. Most loot was sold quickly in nearby ports or traded for food, clothing, and rum. A long voyage was brutal, and pirates knew better than to leave their fortune under the sand. The famous image of a treasure map belongs to novels like Treasure Island, not to real life. There were a few exceptions, like Captain William Kidd, who may have buried some valuables. But those cases are rare and surrounded by rumor. Third, walking the plank. It's one of the most famous pirate scenes in pop culture, but it's mostly fantasy. There are only a handful of historical mentions of anyone being forced to walk off a plank, and most come from sensational newspaper stories written long after the so-called Golden Age of Piracy. In reality, punishments at sea were cruel but simpler. A common fate for mutineers or prisoners was to be marooned, abandoned on a small island with minimal supplies. It was terrifying, but far less theatrical than the stories make it sound. Another myth says that pirates were uneducated and clumsy. In fact, many were skilled sailors and former Navy or merchant officers who knew the art of navigation, map reading, and combat at sea. Steering a ship across the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean required expertise, the kind that came only with experience. Some pirate captains had served legally as privateers, meaning they were once hired by governments to attack enemy ships during wartime. When peace returned and the pay stopped, some of them simply kept going, now outside the law. So while they lived dangerously, pirates were often smart, disciplined professionals in their own rough way. Now, about who pirates actually were. Pop culture usually shows them as white European men, but the real picture was far more diverse. Pirate crews were often multicultural, people from different backgrounds, nations, and languages working together at sea. Sailors from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia served side by side with Europeans, and records show a surprising mix of cultures on the same deck. Some ships even gave refuge to escaped or freed individuals who had nowhere else to go. For many, piracy was a desperate but real path to survival and freedom, one of the few places where skill and courage could matter more than origin or status. Then there's the Jolly Roger, the famous black flag with the skull and bones. Yes, pirates did fly flags to intimidate their victims, but there wasn't just one design. Each captain had his own version. Some used hourglasses, skeletons, or red backgrounds to signal no mercy. The flag wasn't a brand, it was a psychological weapon. Seeing it meant you should surrender fast if you wanted to live. The modern skull and crossbones is just one of many historical variations, but it captured the imagination of later generations and became the symbol we still know today. And what about the parrots, the peg legs, and the eye patches? Those come mostly from novels and movies. Sure, some pirates kept exotic birds as pets. Parrots were common in tropical ports, and some lost limbs in battle or accidents. But the idea that every pirate had a parrot and a wooden leg is pure fantasy. Eye patches might have existed, but mostly as simple medical coverings, not as clever tricks to see in the dark. These are colorful details invented by storytellers who wanted vivid characters, and they worked so well that we still picture them that way centuries later. Here's one of the most surprising facts. Pirate ships weren't always ruled by tyrants. In many cases, they practiced a rough form of democracy. Crews elected their captains and could remove them if they abused power. Everyone agreed on written articles before sailing, rules that set out pay, discipline, and even compensation for injuries. A sailor who lost a hand or leg in battle could receive a larger share of the loot as insurance. This sense of shared risk and shared reward helped pirates maintain order in a life that otherwise offered none. Another myth claims that pirates were simply criminals with no larger meaning. But piracy was deeply tied to the politics and economics of its time. Imagine being a sailor in the early 1700s. Overworked, underpaid, sometimes beaten by officers, and left unpaid for months. When peace treaties ended legal privateering, thousands of skilled seamen found themselves jobless. Turning to piracy was, for many, not rebellion, but survival. It was a way to keep earning when the empire no longer had use for them. Of course, that didn't make it legal, but it explains why piracy spread so quickly and why some communities quietly supported it. And finally, let's talk about how the myth became stronger than the reality. From the early 18th century onward, publishers discovered that pirate stories sold incredibly well. Writers turned real criminals into romantic heroes, exaggerated their adventures, and painted the sea as a place of ultimate freedom. Then came the plays, the pulp novels, and eventually the movies, each generation reshaping the legend to fit its own dreams. But behind the fantasy, the real pirates were still human, tough, resourceful, flawed, and living on the edge of an unforgiving world. So next time you imagine a pirate, picture not just the skull flag or the parrot, but a mixed crew arguing over fair pay, a navigator charting unknown waters, or a tired sailor calculating one last risky raid. The truth doesn't destroy the legend, it deepens it. Pirates weren't just villains or heroes. They were people surviving in the storm between order and chaos. And that's why their story still captures us centuries later. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoy stories like that, please subscribe to the History Fractal for more historical deep dives and myth-busting stories from the past that still shape our imagination today.